London. He's joining us from down the line in Bangkok. Steve, it's great to have you with us because you've written, realms, swathes of research about climate change and economics, and you've got a very strong argument about why modern economics and climate change is wrong. I know it's hard to condense that, but could you give us an idea of your argument?
It's very simple. Fundamentally, the economists have completely misrepresented the science and ignored it where it contradicts their bias that climate change is not a big deal because, in their opinion, capitalism can handle anything and therefore climate change can't be a serious challenge. I wish that was, well, I could describe what I've just said as a parody, but it is precisely what has happened. And to give you the best idea, we all know that people mainly think that economists applied a very high discount rate to reduce future damages, and that's why they get small numbers. But this is Nordhaus commenting on Stern, and he says the reason Nordhaus prefers a high discount rate to the low one in Stern is, and I quote, the relatively small damages in the next 2 centuries get overwhelmed by high damages over the centuries and millennia that follow 2200. So he is claiming the damages in the next 2 centuries are relatively small, including the disappearance we're seeing of Arctic summer sea ice. That is a complete misrepresentation of the science.
How severe is the misrepresentation then, Steve, in your view, in your modelling?
Okay, well, I'm not a mathematical model of economics, not climate, but I'll give 2 of the things which are it can imply what could go wrong with losing the sea ice cover over the Arctic during summer. People, and I thought this myself, that the Arctic is so far north it can't get too much radiation, what's the problem? But in fact, because the Arctic is exposed to the sun 24 hours a day during summer, the amount of solar radiation received by the Arctic during summer is greater than that received by the equatorial band. So that's the amount of energy we're talking about. The energy is going from being reflected into space, about 80% being reflected back by a full ice cover, to 80 or 90% being absorbed because it turns to being dark, absorbent water. Now, what that means is, if that happens, the coldest point in the Arctic region will not be the Arctic, it'll be Greenland. And that implies the possibility, as Paul Beckwith argues, that the centre of rotation of the polar cells could move 1,000 kilometres south. Now, of course, that's going to completely disrupt weather patterns in Europe and America, which is what we're seeing with these crazy cold periods in the last 6 months. So the entire basis of Western agriculture, and Eastern agriculture as well for China, of course, and Russia, could be destroyed by losing the Arctic. It is not the sort of thing you want to exploit to say it's great for extra shipping opportunities. We want to freeze that back the way it was.
Yeah, and in fact, sometimes I worry that the hope for additional shipping opportunities may take some pressure off combating the climate change issue. So to that point, what kind of economic damage are we talking about realistically? How difficult is it to quantify this?
It is very difficult to quantify it, and that is why economists have made up their own numbers. And I use the word made up advisedly because they have simply pretended, and this is from Nordhaus's own research, that 87% of industry will be unaffected by climate change because it happens indoors. He says in carefully controlled environments, but he actually puts all manufacturing, all services, and anything done under a roof, he reckons won't be affected by climate change. Now, that's right, we have no problem. If it's wrong, we're screwed. And of course, this is a crazy bad assumption. The other is that he's assuming he can use the current patterns of weather, of temperature and GDP to predict what's going to happen with climate change. And on that basis, argues effectively that Maryland, just south of New York, which is 10 degrees colder than Florida, will only suffer a 20% fall in GDP if its temperature rises by 10 degrees. But if 10-degree temperature rises occurs, according to scientists, the entire band from 40 degrees north to south of the planet will be uninhabitable by humans because heat exhaustion will be deadly for 50 days or more, even in New York.
Okay, so these, as you say, I'm not a climate scientist either, but the reality you're putting here on the table is quite worrying and relative to some of the other estimates we've heard. But the question I have to you is, what kind of economic firepower needs to be thrown at the problem? Is there still time if, in fact, we were to get more resources on the table here?
If we'd started this 50 years ago when Limits to Growth, which is a far superior piece of research to anything done by economists subsequently, if they're wanting to be taken seriously and we'd done as they suggested, changing our trajectory from 1975 on. We could have done it gradually using things like carbon taxes and so on. Because economists have delayed it by another half century, we are putting, as a species, 3 to 4 times the pressure on the biosphere. We're not going to do it through market mechanisms. I think the only way we can actually do this is effectively a war-level footing of mobilisation to reverse the amount of carbon we've put into the atmosphere, to drastically reduce our consumption now. That's the mindset we need. And unfortunately, economists are encouraging the mindset instead that says, let's take advantage of these new transport routes through the Arctic.
Yeah.
And Steve, just while we've got you, I want to ask about the climate targets of the Paris Accord, you know, the 2 degrees. How much of that is based on the cost to human economic potential versus actual what's going to happen to the environment? Does it mean anything?
Yeah. It doesn't mean anything. We look at the IPCC report, which is written by mainstream economists, the economic section of it. The maximum damage they showed from 3 or 4 degree increase in temperature was about a 15% fall in GDP. Now, that deliberately and completely ignored the possibility of tipping points. So even the most severe estimate was a trivial underestimate of the damage we expect. So I think we should really throw the economists out completely of this discussion and set the politicians down with the scientists to say, these are the potential outcomes of that much of a change to the biosphere. We are toying with forces far in excess of ones we can actually address.
Steve, it's so good to have your perspective today. We really do appreciate it, and on such an important topic. And Rosanna, thank you for bringing us this story, as always. That is Steve Keen of the University College London.